Servus, Matthias here, and this is Singletrack. Alex Bond is back with stories from the recent Yakima Skyline 50K race outside Ellensburg, Washington by Rain Shadow Running. This tough race sports over 9,000 feet of vertical gain in the exposed trail with barely any trees, makes it a tough course for us Western Washington folks used to rain, moss, and damp trails, especially early in the season. I pinged Alex shortly after the race, and he was very frustrated with his performance. He finished, but after having completed the race twice a few years ago, he had higher hopes after a solid winter of serious training. I hoped he could bring some of these thoughts and feelings on the show, not because I wanted to make an example of him, but we all know these moments. We set goals, we train, we're motivated, and then things turn sideways. Running an ultra offers endless challenges, the need to troubleshoot and respond to a variety of issues that arise during the hours on the trail. Alex since has picked himself up on a relaxing trip to the Methow Valley, riding his bike and enjoying the moment. And while the gloominess is gone, many of the questions are still there. So we asked them and we try to find some answers. And with that, let's jump into my conversation with Alex. Welcome back to the show. You had a good weekend in the Methow Valley, I hear.
Yeah, it was nice to go up there and have a little bit of fun. Just very much type 1 fun, but I wanted to go. It's a place I love to go all the time in the winter. It's great. It's got wonderful cross country skiing in the summer. It's too hot and smoky, but here in sort of the shoulder seasons, it's very, very nice up there. And it was a nice, I had a babysitter for my cat, and so I was able to get away and had a very nice couple days up there.
From what I sort of know through the grapevine is that you have a little bit of free time right now on your hand because you're sort of in between jobs. I don't want to probe too much, but that must feel nice to be able to stretch a little bit.
Yeah, it's nice to have a little bit more flexibility in the schedule and, a little bit less real life stress. I still can't do quite whatever I want just because there's still a world around us, and I still have to, I have to be here to take care of my cat and make sure she's getting all the love and attention she wants and everything. But it is nice to be able to get away for a couple days here and there and do some different stuff.
I'm desperately trying to figure out how to pronounce Methow Valley correctly. I was warned before I had my call with Allison a few weeks ago, and then I promptly said it wrong anyway during the show, and so now I'm trying to make up for it by talking with you about the Methow Valley. So you had lots of fun over there, but before you went over there, you had a race, and this is sort of the main subject of this call, if you will, because you geared up quite a bit for this race. You've ran this race before, and you tell the story of it. So lay it out for us. What race did you do?
Yeah, and I think the race is the Yakima Skyline 50K. It's in between Ellensburg and Yakima in the canyon in there. I'd done it twice before in 2017 and 2018, and it's a very difficult race. It's in 2017, I think I took it a little bit. I didn't know how hard it was going to be, and I think I didn't take it maybe seriously enough, and it was very challenging. And then in 2018, I was undertrained, and I really had I probably should have figured out how to drop down to the 25K. I think I had no business really attempting it, and that was even more challenging. And so, my thought this year was, to go back and get revenge and sort of get this, try to have a really fantastic performance there. It was really I think I've done maybe 6 or 7 or 8 maybe ultra marathons or trail marathons at this point. And this was kind of the first one that I had a goal more specific than just show up and do my best. Normally that's just sort of, I'll just show up and have fun and see how it goes, especially when you're doing a race for the first time. You don't really have the expectations. And so this was sort of the time when I had these past times I had done, and I knew all the splits, and I really had a specific goal of, I want to be faster than I have been there before. And, and so, yeah, I was training all winter and stuff like that. And, and I was really happy with the training. I was, like I said, I did this in 2017 and 2018, and I ran some of the same routes that I did when I was training in those past years and went faster on them. If I did a training day that was, on this particular route and I did it, 45 minutes faster than I did in 2018, I'm faster than I was in 2018. I should be faster than I was on race day. And, cutting to the chase, the race did not go to plan. I did finish, but I was only barely faster than I was in 2018, and I was almost half an hour slower than I was in 2017. And so it was a really frustrating day, and I think, we're not, don't need to get too much into the blow by blow of, what went wrong and when, but I think it's more interesting to sort of talk about the mental side of how do you, first of all, process that and how does that go? And then a little bit about, maybe what sort of happened within the race. But, the thing about this particular course is, so it's 50K and it's about 9,000 feet of climbing. I hear some people say anywhere from about 9,000 to maybe 9,400. I think it's probably around 9,000, but that's a decent amount. And it's pretty much just 4 big climbs and 4 descents. There's 2 big hills and it's an out and back. So you go up the hill and then down the hill and then up the hill and then down the hill. And then you do the same thing back in the reverse order. And so it's a very simple course. Each hill is about the same size. And so you really have these perfect opportunities to say at like the 25% point, the halfway point, and the 75% point, really check in on, it's really easy to like track your splits and to figure out how you're doing. So at least for me, like, the first half of the race went pretty well. I hit the halfway point at where I wanted to be and that kind of a thing. And then, like happens to folks sometimes, the wheels just kind of fell off the bus. You start getting tired, you start slowing down. And, I think and which happens to everybody, your stomach unless you're having that magical perfect day, your stomach kind of always starts to not feel good and you don't want to eat food. And, some of your muscles start to say, no, I don't want to go down, they start to get sore when you go downhill because 9,000 feet is a lot. And that's, and that's kind of normal. And, and so the sort of the physical discomfort was something I kind of expected. I think what was a surprise really, and what I think kind of undermined me and got me was this sort of mental self-talk thing. And it wasn't, people talk about sports psychology. I think a lot of times elite athletes talk about sports psychology and sort of how they deal with the pressure of, this is my career and it's very important. And there's, books like The Inner Game of Tennis that taught, and I mean, there's professional sports psychologists and all that sort of stuff. I mean, there's a huge industry and network around this. And it was something that, for me as a casual amateur athlete, I had never really dealt with. Well, I think we all deal with sports psychology issues in terms of self-esteem and self-confidence about, am I fit or am I not? Am I when I see somebody else go faster than me on Strava, how do I feel about that? But within the event, I had never quite had a sports psychology situation like this where, you have a very specific time goal. You have very easy splits to track because I'm at the top of the hill, I'm at the bottom of the hill, and I've done it twice before, so I know where I've been and where I want to be. And then just sort of getting into this cycle of, when it seems like things can spiral for the better or spiral for the worse. If you're going faster and faster and you're like, whoa, I'm going fast, this feels great, like that gives you positive feedback and you want to go, I'm being successful. I want to double down on this success. That feels good. When it goes the negative way, you can get into this kind of negative spiral of self-talk about, oh, I'm not going fast enough. I was slow on my last split there. I need to, I'm not going to succeed at my goal. And even if actually you're not that far off And at that point, physically you're not any worse than you could be with a more positive mental mindset. It gets so much tougher to push through the discomfort, to eat the food that you don't want to eat, because your stomach hurts and that kind of thing. And then you just get into this negative spiral. And that was really the first time I'd had an experience with it. And I didn't really have the tools to win the argument with myself, because it was, it's something I've never really done research into, that sort of self-talk within the event kind of a thing. I think folks who want to learn about training, it's very easy to learn about training. There's all these books about how to run a 50K, how to, structure your training. You should increase your mileage by 10% a week. Like you should do your long run on your long run should be this long. Should you, how do you do your intervals? And there's oodles of information about this on the internet. And I assume, and I'd read a bunch of it, and I assume there must probably be oodles of information out there also about sports psychology, but it's something I had never paid attention to before. And so when I started having this negative spiral happen, it was just kind of like, oh my God, what do I do? And I ended up really getting into like a negative and dark place. And that's not a place to be in to succeed,
Well, number one, congratulations for finishing. Number two, thank you for sharing and bringing up a very, very important and interesting subject. Because you are right that I think we can train for a lot of things. We can even train for nutrition in that regard, that we can learn to figure out what endurance fuel works for us and adjust our ratio based on weather, and learn to kind of listen to our body. And so I think when we go into these races, we are so focused on listening to our body that we don't really think about our mind. And you've perhaps unbeknownst probably put yourself into the very difficult place, because I was worried about that for myself a few years ago when I had sort of done my first few races, and I had asked myself, and where I sort of was anticipating the challenge and thinking to myself, well, if I go back and do the same race again, there will be this added pressure of performing better, because I'm supposed to be better, because I know the course. I should be doing better, right? And so you're putting an extra layer of stress on it. And an easy way to avoid that is by just constantly doing new races, different courses. That way you never have that comparison. And you completely avoid this, right? And there was a big question that I had for myself early on when I sort of had done most of the obvious races in my area. And I was coming, so, the year was kind of eclipsing, and I was asking myself, okay, so should I do these races again? And I was realizing that I would potentially run into that.
It's interesting because the comparison to my past self was, and maybe this is not a great idea, but I specifically chose to do this race again that I had done before because I wanted that. Mm-hmm. And I guess to add a little bit broader context, I've thought for a while that probably 2017 was probably the fittest year I have had. I think like that was probably my best year in terms of my fitness. I mean, and so my thought was, and this was the dream scenario, the dream goal, is that if I want to do big, challenging, scary things, I want to prove to myself that I am ready to do those big, challenging, scary things. How can I prove to myself that I'm ready to do big, challenging, scary things? If I run, so at Yakima Skyline 50K in 2017, if that was the fastest I've ever been, or the fittest I've ever been, if I go faster than I was then, that's proof to me that I am fitter than the fittest I've ever been. And that's then proof to me that then this summer I can go out and I can go attempt big, scary, challenging things. Now, this is. I'm not going to say that this is necessarily the best way to approach things.
It seems like a logical thing to do, right? You sort of put a yardstick into the ground and saying, well, I'm testing myself because I have bigger goals and I want to see how I do it. What I think the challenge is that this yardstick, unbeknownst, added a level of mental pressure that you sort of shouldn't have needed to deal with in that race.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one of the big issues is, people talk about process versus outcome goals. And I think that approach of sort of saying this particular race will prove to me that I am fit, first of all, one particular day is not how you prove that or not. That's not a healthy goal to set. That's an outcome goal that's about a specific day. It's not sort of the process goal of, actually the way to prove to yourself that you're fit maybe is to train consistently, get a certain number of hours, or, have this series of, not just one particular outcome on one particular day, but, over seeing a general trend of improvement or whatever sort of more nuanced or more thoughtful goal or metric for success, is than just sort of saying on this one particular day, I want to go faster than I did 5 years ago. I think the other issue with it, besides it being a poor method of goal setting, is then if you do in fact not hit that goal, as happened with me, then what happens to your mental state after that? Where if your whole thing was, I'm going to be really successful at this race and that's going to be proof to me that I'm fit and ready to take on these bigger challenges, then if it doesn't go to plan, which, sometimes it doesn't, then that can leave your self-confidence in a really weakened state. And then maybe, now I don't feel comfortable attempting these other future things that I had in mind because it was all resting on the idea that I was going to prove it to myself at this race, and I didn't do that. And so I think that then that's sort of an additional mental thing to sort of process about, what comes next after you set a goal and you didn't achieve it. Is it a situation where, hey, that wasn't really a great goal to set. We should have focused more on a process thing than on a specific one-day outcome. Or how do you sort of process that? And I think that that's something, and of course, right after the race, during the race, I was super down in the dumps. This negative spiral was really going to a dark place. And I think, not to go full on therapy kind of a thing, but, I think many of us are our own harshest critics, and we say things to ourselves that we would never in a million years say to other people. And so I was feeling terrible about myself during the last few miles of this race. I was feeling terrible about myself. Oh my gosh, how is it that all these other people are so much better than me? I have no place, so on and so forth. And then afterwards as well, it takes time, you feel bad about it. And I think a lot of people were very nice, and very supportive, and I appreciate, sort of the comments that I got from folks, and the conversations I've had with people, have been helpful. I think sometimes, like, if anything, it was almost too much, though, because sometimes it is okay to be frustrated, I don't know. I struggle with, this is maybe getting into a separate thing, but I think I was legitimately, I think it was okay for me to be frustrated with it. I had this really good training cycle, and, I think, I should, it's not like I don't think I did my best on that day. I think, it's okay to say I did not do my best, and I'm frustrated with that, and I didn't express the fitness that I had. And I think, sometimes, this sort of attitude of, hey, well, at least you finished, like, good on you for that. It's like, well,
okay.
Sometimes that's not really the goal. Sometimes it's okay to, it's also okay to be frustrated with that. And so I think that that's sort of a separate thing maybe, but,
Well, okay,
I don't know.
then why don't we take it apart then? Because I think the dark space came after you realized the performance that you anticipated wasn't there. Have you had any thoughts on why the performance wasn't there? Like let's move away from the mental to the physical place and saying, why do you think you figured out a reason of why you weren't able to call up your physical expectations?
Oh, I think the mental, there are little things like, I know I didn't eat enough in the second half of the race, that kind of a thing. But I legitimately think that the mental state impacted the physical.
Oh, okay.
Because when you're in this situation of, the end of an ultra is always going to be painful and unpleasant, right? I mean, it sucks. This is a dumb thing. It's a bad sport. People shouldn't do it, right? I mean, this is not, it hurts. It hurts. It always hurts. And, when you're in that position of pain and discomfort, you have a choice to make. You can either push through that and still try to go as fast as hard as you can, or you can decide, this sucks. I'm just going to walk the rest of the way to the finish.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're making that decision, if you feel like I've already failed, what's the point of me pushing hard and doing all this suffering if I'm already failing? If I'm guaranteed to fail at this point, what's the point? Why should I take on that extra suffering? Just walk. And that's what happened to me. And what's tough about that is you're not necessarily that initial conclusion that, oh, I've already failed, I might as well just walk the rest. That initial thought that I've already failed, that might not actually be true. And
okay.
Going back and looking at some of the splits, it's like, well, actually, like if I had, maybe I was going a little bit slower than ideal. Maybe I wouldn't have hit a home run. I was going a little bit slower than that. But I still could have done okay if I had continued to push. But because I was in this bad mental state and not thinking clearly, I made this decision to take it, to not push as much through the pain and to, why not sit down by the side of the trail for a couple minutes? Because, at the end of the day, if you're going to be this far off the goal, it doesn't make a difference. Well, actually, it kind of does make, a couple minutes faster would actually be nice maybe. But I think that's truly what happened, is that negative mental space made it too difficult for me to express whatever physical potential I did have on the day.
Yeah. I do feel like that there are two thoughts that I'd like to explore. One of them is really one more time asking, if you would have performed well, the negative thoughts wouldn't have come because you would have lived up to your expectations. So I would like to ask one more time if you think, because if you say, well, I didn't eat enough, where in the second half of the race, well, that is a physical thing that you can train for, right? I mean, if I'd be your training coach who would be solely thinking about the physical aspects and not the psychological mental aspects, then I would definitely dig into your numbers and saying, well, the only way these dark thoughts came up is because you didn't live up to your own performance. So let's look at your performance and try to take it apart. So that would be the first aspect. And the second aspect is then, okay, how, when you're in this dark place and you feel like you could rally, how can you train on getting yourself out? Which is a complete separate conversation. But I think that is sort of an interesting thing that we also don't train for, and we need sort of life coaching experience for, because I think there are definitely ways of dealing with it to not necessarily make you perform better, but at least make you happy again, even during the race, right? Because you could sort of like find a way of saying, like I've done it in a race when I felt really low. I sort of instead of feeling bad that somebody who was really far behind me was able to catch up with me, I sort of hitched on to them and said, why don't we have a conversation? Why don't we, and sort of distract myself from the fact. It switched the focus of what the race was all about for me, which was performance, and made it more of a community thing. I'm like, let's just hang with the people. And then afterwards I could sort of blame my lack of or living up to the performance expectation on saying, yeah, but I had a really great time because I talked to all these people and stuff, and so I sort of trick myself in at least still having a good time on the trail, even if I still have to afterwards look at the numbers and say, yeah, okay, that wasn't really what I wanted, right? But before we go there, let me ask you one more time. Do you think that there's anything that you could have done physically, preparation-wise, athletically, I think that's the right word, to even prevent that dark space?
I think there's sort of both within the race and then within it, there's in training, preparing for the race, and then there's within the race itself. I think in training, obviously, like everybody's training cycle can be, you could nitpick about how, you should have, gone for a run here instead of a bike ride, or, here at this point, you missed this, you had a long day at work and you missed this particular workout. But like, I feel like generally, like if you lay out a training cycle and you get, 90-95% of it right, like that's about as realistically as, for those of us with lives, like that's about as good as it's gonna be. And that's how I feel like I did in training. I think you could nitpick here and there, and that I should have done this workout, I should have done an extra long run here or something like that. But for the most part, like if you get it 90% of the way right, like that's good. That should be good enough. For us, obviously if you're trying to win Western States, like that's different. But like for an amateur athlete who's trying to finish, in a not particularly fast time here, I think if you get it 90% of the way right, you're doing pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Do you think your taper was okay?
Yeah, I think you could, I think it was fine. Again, you could maybe nitpick here and there, but for the most part, maybe I should have done one more 6-hour kind of long run. Maybe I should have, but is in the context of, 4 months training for this, does one run really make that much of a difference? I mean, yeah, the long runs are important, but like, does one more long run really make the difference in the context of 4 months? Like, I don't think so.
Yeah. And you also didn't overtrain.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't, I felt fine. It was, so I don't know. I mean, I think, and, maybe it could be, I should have done, sort of a quote unquote practice race to get used to sort of that sort of thing. It's, maybe, but again, like this is small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. If you if you generally get things, like I said, 90% of the way right, that should be enough.
Okay, and the last question around this is, do you feel like if you would have trained, was the race incomparable terrain of what you were training on?
I at this point, I've done this race. It was the third time doing the race. I've done a couple training runs there on the course. I think if there is a big challenge with the course, it's that there are basically no trees on the entire thing. It's sunny the entire time. They said it was a cooler race than normal this year. I sure didn't think so. I thought it was pretty hot. And, I think one of the big challenges for it is that those of us who are, and this also applies to a lot of heat races, we spend the winter running through the rainy forest here, and then we go over to Eastern Washington or to Southern California or Arizona or whatever for that spring race we want to do, and it's sunny and it's hot, and we're like, this is nothing like what I've been doing in training, I'm not used to this. And so, I do wonder about if the heat was a factor. It seemed like, because it's one of those things that the second half of the race was more challenging. Well, also the second half of the race was what's afternoon, and so it's hotter. At the same time, it's also like it was harder because it was the second half of the race and I was really tired. And so, it's really hard to say how much the heat plays into it. But I think that is a factor. I'm not a big fan of the heat in general. And so maybe it's a bad idea for me to keep trying to do this hot, sunny race that has no trees and no protection from the sun.
Early on in the season when you didn't train for it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is not something to ignore, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also, man, there's this one, it's the second descent and then the third climb. It's not too bad on the climb because you're hiking it, but like it is actually one of the rockiest trails I've ever been on. It's incredible. I've been on some really rough trails, and this one is way up there for taking the cake. It is, and it's so tough because you're descending and you want to go fast, and I'm sure the people who win the race go very fast on it, but at least it's tough because it's one that you want to make up time, you want to go fast, but it's just so incredibly rocky, and I wonder, I don't know, that is one tough descent. That is one tough descent. So I don't know. If there was one part of if I was to, and I don't know if I'll do this race again, maybe someday I will, but if I was to do it again, that I would try to spend more time there or something like that, because that was really something.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think we talked about all the physical thoughts, the athletic aspects that I thought of as I was listening to you, that I felt like for our listeners is they are like, not just hearing your story, but also kind of comparing it to their races. And so those are the things that I've been thinking about in my career, and I'm not a coach. I don't have any experience. I can't back that up with anything, but I thought it would be interesting to sort of talk through these various things, because sometimes we forget about them. Sometimes we don't think about it. So, I think we can now switch to the mental aspect of it, because that is, according to you, for you, the bigger thing, and I think that is the aspect that is talked about less, right? And that is, how do you either preserve, I don't even know, because it already sounds negative, to preserve this state of blissful ignorance of like, oh, I'm just floating in the moment and nothing else matters. Mm-hmm. And or if you are in a negative space, can you claw yourself back, right? How do you like snap out of it?
Yeah, and I'm actually really interested to learn more about this. I need to find some books or something like that, because there's got to be tools out there for doing this. I think the watchword, a lot of people in ultras talk about how, hey, if you feel good, don't get too happy about it because you're going to feel worse later. And if you feel bad, don't get too sad about it because you're going to feel better later. I think that that's sort of been the advice I've heard, which I don't think, at least not for me, it didn't work, because I didn't feel better later. And I think maybe within the short, a 50, maybe a 100-miler, which I've never done, is long enough that, you can have a little bit more of that huge range. But, at least within the context of this 50K, like if you've got at least, I went into a hole and I didn't come back out, and so I think, the other thing is, at least what has happened for me was, it was sort of a logical discussion of how is it actually going. And so the example I'll give is like earlier in the race, in the first half of the race, on the second climb, I started getting kind of in a little bit of a negative headspace about, boy, I should be going faster. I think I should be going faster than this. I'm not going fast enough. I'm going to miss my next split. And then I got to the top, and like, that's the kind of thing that like, oh, I'm getting in a negative headspace. And then I got to the top of the hill and I looked at my watch and I was like, oh, actually I'm fine. And all that negative, that little devil on my shoulder was like, oh yeah, you're fine. Like, cool, go for it. And I think because I had that like here's a rational piece of evidence that actually I'm doing just fine. And it was like, okay, great, we're going to be okay. And then in the second half of the race, it had this sort of similar devil on the shoulder, angel on the shoulder argument about how am I doing. And it was a little bit, the angel, when the devil on my shoulder was saying, Alex, you're going too slow, you're not doing well enough. The angel on my shoulder was like, he's actually kind of right. That was what was tough, was that I was starting to fall behind the splits I wanted a little bit and stuff like that. And so I think maybe it was a thing where I was too closely wedded to wanting to hit these specific times, or I was too committed to, I don't know what exactly it was, but that when you are able to logically say, your IT band really does actually hurt quite badly, like that's evidence that things are not going great. And so if your whole point is to try to do at least for me, it was like, well, that's not helpful to have. And so I've got to do some research and figure out what the mental tools are that people use to win that argument, because there's got to be, there's many sports psychologists out in the world, and they do work with, all sorts of folks, from professional athletes to, I assume amateur athletes as well sometimes. And, there's got to be information and resources out there to learn about this. And it's something that, again, I think I've just never really done research into. And so I'm interested to learn what's out there in that respect.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, again, right, I'm talking like with absolutely no experience. I'm just a white male podcaster, so I have all the answers. But I mean, it is interesting to see the athletes that are performing really well on the highest level, who can win a soccer World Cup or something, that they are definitely protecting themselves even beforehand to ensure that they are staying sort of in a mental bubble of happiness and focus, which is something that is more trying to prevent like outside forces coming in, right? But the other one is to sort of, I see athletes tricking themselves. I mean, they find specific things that will, I know that they know that will bring them happiness, right? And something can, and they know that that doesn't always work, but they know that this moment can come, and so they sort of like have a weapon in their arsenal, right? I mean, I think for me, especially late in a race, it's Coke. I love drinking Coke, and it's something that I try not to drink too much because of the sugar caffeine spike, but finding a physical aspect that you can carry with you, or you can find in an aid station that you know that will sort of delight you, can be a big mental changer. Like, I've been at one aid station late in a race at Squamish, and I wasn't really feeling well, but this runner comes up next to me and she asks for beer, and they pour her some beer into a cup. She didn't drink the whole can, right? And so I asked for a couple sips too, and it felt good because I had lots of sweet stuff beforehand, and B, it felt so rewarding to be able to indulge before the finish line. And so I do look for things like this. I love Snickers bars, and I know those things seem very trivial. But I do think things like that can really help, where you sort of purposely try to stimulate yourself with something that you know is rewarding or brings you happiness. Because I think there is an aspect where you need to find a way of tricking your mind. You need to find a way of jumping out of this headspace and reward yourself with something to sort of, or, distract yourself.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's it. I think, I guess my thought is, what do you do? It's what do you do outside of the aid station is a little sometimes maybe a bit more of a challenge, because I think one of the things that did give me a big boost in the race was like coming into that 3/4 of the way through aid station, and by that point there weren't at the tail end of the race there we were pretty spread out, and so there were like two runners in the aid station and like 4 volunteers, so they were kind of all over us, but it was a very supportive atmosphere, and it was like, whoa, this feels really good. And then and I felt great in the aid station, and then of course 5 minutes outside of the aid station you're going up the hill again, and it's like, whoa, this is not great. So I think your point is well taken. I think it's also sort of what you need to figure out what will work when you are out there by yourself on the hill, just sort of.
Do you listen to music?
Yeah, so that was actually one thing. I did start listening to music on it, and that was kind of one of the things I had hoped for was that when it gets hard in the last third of the race, I'll put on music and that'll help. And I think maybe it helped a little bit, but it didn't quite give me like the superpower surge that I maybe was hoping for. But I think in general, it's and that's something that's very supported, of course, by like evidence that, people who are listening to higher energy music will do better in a sports test on a treadmill. I mean, this is like proven absolutely by science, and so it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that there is the aspect of sort of emotional distraction, right? Hey, this song makes me happy, right? I sort of have these sort of emotional connection to it. But I also have experienced myself that just by listening to music, especially if you're sort of dealing with the pointlessness of putting one foot in front of the other, right? If you didn't listen to music for 3/4 of the race and then listen to music, all of a sudden you don't hear yourself anymore, right? You don't hear your steps anymore. You don't hear the rubbing of your vest that has sort of started to annoy you. And I found this like really freeing to be all of a sudden sort of in a different headspace of like, oh wow, yeah, sure, I still need to move forward, but I don't hear the monotony that reminds me of the pointlessness of my actions, if you will. And so that has really helped me in past too, right?
Yeah, and I think what probably makes sense to do is to have a quiver of these things to use, because if the music doesn't work, then maybe the treat in the aid station does, or if there I've heard about people who have the mantras that they repeat that give them power and energy, and it's like, okay, like you have to have as many of these things in your quiver as possible, so that if any particular thing doesn't work, you can go on to the next one and see if that does. So that's probably the way to go. And, I guess, to some degree you can test these things out in training, and maybe that's, I don't know how much of it you have to test in training versus simulate in an actual race environment. And so maybe it's a matter of doing some more training races, and sort of practicing, putting yourself into that difficult situation and practicing, this is what I'm going to do to get myself out of it, kind of a thing. But yeah.
I mean, there is definitely something where you can practice racing, and there is something where you gain the experience of how does it feel putting a bib on in a less pressure environment. You had mentioned earlier today, perhaps earlier in the conversation, perhaps you should have done a training race leading up to this. Perhaps you just put too much focus on this one event, especially because it was meant to be sort of a yardstick for your summer adventures, and so that was riding so much on it. So if you would have done a 20K a month prior or so, perhaps you would have taken a little bit off the edge of the expectation of this race, right?
Yeah, and I think if there was sort of a mistake in if I did make a mistake in the planning, I mean, that was it, but, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the best way. I need to do some learning about what is the best way to do this. And I think, yeah, it seems like it's also more complicated than the physical training, because the physical training, it sort of says, okay, well, for your intervals, go from doing 3 sets of 5 minutes to 5 sets of 3 minutes. And it's like, okay, well, that's, a lot more, that's a lot simpler than how do you explore, the depths of your soul in this physically demanding, time to, it's just like, it's so much more complex, and the learning seems so much more complex that, there's definitely something that needs to be.
Yeah. And I think this is where the mental aspect, obviously more so than probably any other aspect, or even though the physical aspect obviously has a huge influence on our athletic performance too. If you have a physical job, we are more exhausted. It will be harder to find out training miles or and stuff. But the mental aspect, I think, that spills into our real life too, and probably even more so, because how we make decisions in real life will help us in these athletic performances, and vice versa. And the way, and again, right, just being a podcaster here, this is not medical advice, everyone listening to this podcast. Disclaimer. No, but I think the way you're speaking about yourself and how you operate, you're speaking about things from a very analytical thing. Point of view. You're saying you want to read a book, you want to learn about it, and I think that speaks to you as a character, and I think you will find a solution in the same way, right? So me suggesting, just hide a Snickers bar in your race vest and trick yourself like you would trick a dog into having successfully made a jump, that you get a treat if you in order to get yourself out of headspace, might not work for you, because you are sort of a more analytical person who has to approach it from a different way. And so I think we all have sort of different ways of how we approach it, because you just said doing an interval training makes sense to me. For me, as somebody, doesn't make any sense to me. I cannot get myself into this number game. I mean, maybe it seems reasonable, but it doesn't make sense to me. So I think different people have different approaches to how we are going into this. And you sound very analytical, so you will find a solution in that way too, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why, in some ways, this mental side of it is so much more, because everybody processes it in so many different ways. There's no like website you can go on to where it says like, here's how you do this. It's like, oh, no, great, now I know how to, there's no one size fits all kind of thing. There's, and as complex as our bodies are and the physical part of ourselves are, like our brains are obviously and our emotions are obviously so much more unique and complicated, and so it's not simple. And I think it's something that. And so I don't even know necessarily the best way to, like I said, I've talked about, I need to do research or whatever, but how do you actually learn how to do this in practice? That's a whole different thing. It's a lot easier to read a book than to actually do something for real. And so, there's a lot of learning to do, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. It is interesting, because what I'm reminded of is that in Germany, something that's very popular, and it's very popular in the US too, but it has such a different approach in Germany, is this: people do life coaching seminars where they're sort of really focusing on how do you kind of break through this. And obviously this stuff exists over here too, but I feel like that well is so poisoned by those multi-level marketer success coaching type people, right? Who just want you to buy this shake for yourself and for your 15 neighbors, and then you'll be successful. But I think that there is an aspect there where you sort of focus on this. And so I think you will find the resources. That's what I'm trying to say. You just have to sort of dig deeper, because there is so much. You too could be rich and famous and beautiful talk that you have to find the right kind of research-based, reasonable, actual something that works without the hype of the loud success speakers, right?
I completely agree. Yeah, that's the thing with you don't want to get caught up with the scam people, and but somebody's got to be, and even the people who are serious. I mean, I've read about, some of these folks who have, self-help books, for lack of a better term, like I'm sure some of those are actually interesting and really helpful books. I'm sure some of them are also total BS, and how do you figure out which is which? It's not simple.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think that there's definitely a solution there, which in the end, once you figured out what speaks to you, you can, I think, fairly quickly find a path to what works for you. You just kind of have to navigate this. I think this is the second episode in a row that I'm bringing up this Formula One Netflix show, Drive to Survive or something like that, where they're sort of giving this real reality show back and view into Formula One race car driving. And one of the things that I've observed that sort of found interesting is that all these race car drivers who were, early 20s, super wide-eyed boys who don't really know anything about life and stuff, they almost always are surrounded by a coach. And I think some of it is because the cameras are there, so there's sort of a I want to make sure that you say the right thing, right? It's more of a brand thing, but they have somebody that they can sort of look at and say, what am I supposed to do now? What's going on? So I think this is definitely a big aspect of the need for management, the need for attention, the need for focus as you're getting into this stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think maybe that's, I think people who are, it's interesting that, when you look at people who are really successful in their fields, coaching, whether that is like a formal, relationship where you hire somebody, or it's more sort of a, mentorship kind of a thing. But this is, certainly within professional sports. I mean, there's no basketball or, there's no NBA teams or NFL teams or soccer teams that don't have a coach, right? And just like, we'll just wing it. We'll just figure out our own thing. Like, no, the obviously there's, millions of dollars going on there and everything, but, people who are really serious about it, they have like professional help with this kind of stuff.
And they have an entire staff, right? It's not just the coach who gives you the strategy, but there's a coach for this and a coach for this and a coach for this, right? I mean, this is a huge need, if you will. That's a huge point.
And I think for the amateur athlete, the thought is sort of, obviously, there aren't millions of dollars at stake based on, how my run goes. But, in the same way that there might be for, Kipchoge or somebody, but, and so then it kind of comes down to like, okay, well, what actually makes sense for you and your life, for somebody in their lifestyle and everything. But, it does make you think like, hey, if the pros all do this, like if this is something that you want to take really seriously, like, maybe this is what amateurs should do if they can fit it into their lifestyles and their budgets and so forth. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe there's something to that.
I think so too. I mean, all the coaches that I've had here on Singletrack, I've always had the feeling that what they see as the most value, right, is not the checklist of training plans of like, oh, good job, you did exactly the training that I laid out for you. It was all about the relationship and to be able to see someone grow and helping them sort of navigate through how do you deal with achieving your results or not achieving your results, right? And so I think that there is the psychological value outweighs the sort of athletic benefits of following a structured training plan. That's what I've been hearing as I'm talking this through, as I'm talking with coaches who are advertising to be athletic coaches, right? They're not saying, oh yeah, I do life coaching. They are approaching it very much from we start at the training plan and the foundation of physical activity and athleticism, but what we are actually doing is something completely different, right? Or not completely different, but there is something else there.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of and I'm sure there are probably coaches that are more about on Monday do this and on Tuesday do that, and there's other ones that are a bit more about how do we, how do you manage the goals and mental side of things, kind of a thing. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, and it's something we're thinking about because, as you talk about something like doing research, we it's normal, it's increasingly normal now for people to, go to a therapist for their, real life, mental and emotional help, and if I don't know, I just sort of think like, yeah, if this stuff is kind of getting normalized for, that it's an expectation that normal people do, then like, why, if you're able to have that kind of help for your athletic life, why not at least consider it? I don't know.
And I hear your hesitation because I feel like one of the things that we've always enjoyed and praised and promoted about our sport is the simplicity of it, right? You're supposed to not need super expensive gear. You're not supposed to have this this hurdle that you need to climb through in order to participate, right? And having a coach is a monthly expense that costs a lot of commitment. And I think that, it shouldn't become a requirement for us to do this sport. But if we are chasing goals, it might make sense, I mean, I just had this conversation yesterday. It was like, well, I am turning 45 this year. Should I make one more attempt in trying to get into UTMB? Should I try one more time? I mean, the logistics and the complications of trying to run this race now aside, right? Should I try to athletically move myself into a place to where I could do that? And if I come up with a yes, should I try to do it solo and potentially fail? Or should I say, well, if I have this goal, if this is really so valuable to me, perhaps I should actually get a coach, because then I would have a higher possibility of success, because I'm actually sort of have somebody on the side who's done it before, knows what they're doing, and can talk to me about what I'm doing rather than just my own thoughts, who, they are just as good as however way I feel like in the moment.
Yeah, well, and I think, and obviously, like, having a coach, they can't do the running for you. You still have to do, a lot of the work. But it seems like, so I don't know. It's food for thought. But, I don't know. It's something I've sort of thought about. It's something, I increasingly think about as, like, something that's being normalized in other parts of life, like, life coaches or, professional coaches and mentorship there. And, I thought about, when I was a kid, I played music, and, you have a music teacher, and it's like, you have, it's like, okay, like, if that was something I did, when I was learning to play, why, now my running is as much of a part of my life now as music was then, arguably. And, so if I was paying, if my family was, paying a music teacher to, like, I don't know. Of course I was a kid then, and I don't know. It gets more complicated, but it's something to think about.
For sure, for sure. Well, lots to think about. I've got a couple more questions for you. One is, you've had big plans for the rest of the summer with you sort of gotten sort of smacked in the faces last weekend. I mean, I am not going to say has anything changed. I mean, you still are excited to see what the summer holds. Do you want to tell the listeners a couple things that you have on the horizon, that you're eyeing, that you're planning on?
Well, I think one of the things is that, I think I do, and I hope maybe other folks who've had a frustrating race can relate to this, is like, yeah, I was super down on myself during this race and immediately afterwards. I felt really, really bad that night, the next day. I was really down in the dumps. And I think that was completely legitimate because I had expectations that were reasonable that I did not meet. And it's okay to be frustrated with that. And I think, it did help that I was able to take some time and go ride my bike and have some a lot of folks have heard about the type 1 versus type 2 fun, and it was actually it really, really helped to go out and just have some fun, because I think, and specifically like using my body and my fitness to have fun. I think going from a place where I was really frustrated with my body and my fitness, and that at the end of and after this race, I was, I was unhappy with my body. I was unhappy with my fitness. And then being able to go out and ride my bike and have fun, it was like, oh, right, I'm reminded that my body and my fitness can bring me happiness and joy. And I think that was really important. I think that was maybe more than, I think just some time helps with that frustration and calming it a little bit. Just, obviously the day of a frustrating thing is going to be really unpleasant, and it gets better with time. But I think being able to be reminded of how much what you actually are capable of, and yes, you had a frustrating day with your body and your fitness, but then you can also have a good day. And that was really, and not necessarily doing something that was too hard, not trying to dig deep into the well again, because, that could kind of continue a negative spiral or something like that. Just going out and having some good type 1 fun really helped me. And now it's a little bit later, and I've had a bit more perspective, and I really do feel better about myself. And I think it's good to be reminded that just in the same way that, we are never as good as our best days are, and we're never as bad as our worst days, and I think if it's probably not fair to judge myself based on the best workout I've ever had and say, wow, I had the best workout I've ever had, like I'm the fittest ever. It's like, well, no, you're probably not. You just got out on the right side of the bed that morning and happened to have an extra pep in your step. You also don't get to judge yourself on, if you had a bad race, hey, you know what? It happens. I think, and so getting a little bit of that feeling, it really helps. And so I'm still planning on trying to do some cool stuff this summer. I'm not at this point changing my, I want to, we'll see what happens, of course, with the smoke and so forth. That's the big concern about what will August be like. But, I've got a list of some big, runs that I want to do. I'm putting together something that's sort of a bike run kind of a thing, up around Highway 20 in the North Cascades. I want to do some multi-day stuff. I've done a decent number of like reasonably big single day things, but, and then of course I've gone backpacking and done multi-day stuff that was at at a very low intensity. But, what is it like to try to go at higher intensity for multiple days in a row? I'm interested in exploring that. And so trying to do something that's, 3 or 4 hard days in a row. That's and then maybe it turns out that I like that. Maybe it turns out that I hate that, or I don't do well at that. Who knows? It's something I've never really explored. And so, that's sort of something I'd like to do this summer. I don't want to get too specific just because you never know what life will actually bring. But I'm looking, I plan to ride my bike a lot more. I've been riding my bike more this spring. It's a lot of fun. It's actually really good. So I've got some big bike rides I want to do. I like the idea of doing combined run bike kind of stuff. I think that there's ways to integrate those in creative ways that, maybe there are, to bring a human powered element to things that get a bit more interesting. So anyways, I think in general, because I'm not a particularly fast guy, I think that sort of creativity when it comes up is an opportunity to do something that is like cool and exciting without necessarily being the fastest out there. And so, I'm kind of trying to figure some of that kind of stuff out. Where can I do something that uses those multiple sports, that is both run and bike, something that, maybe is a multi-day thing that links together a couple cool different days together into one multi-day thing. We'll sort of see. I mean, this is just sort of nonsense, I guess, because I'm not actually saying anything real, but I'm looking forward to, riding my bike more, getting back up into the mountains and trying to do some interesting stuff, and we'll see how it ends up going. But yeah,
I don't think it's nonsense at all. I love that our sport allows us to not just train for races, that it's multidimensional, that we do have the adventure side of our sport. And I think sometimes in the wintertime we're biding our times because the mountains are covered in snow. There's only so much you can do, and the races are coming back before the adventures come back, because the races can be held in low level and they get the attention, right? A juggernaut could be run all year long, and so many races can happen in low level, where in the summertime I don't know if I would run through the Juggernaut Mountains outside of a training run, right? As a pure adventure, right? And so I'm not poo-pooing on the Juggernaut Mountains. I mean, the Capel Forest, the same thing. The Capel Forest gets quieter in the summertime when people actually can go into the mountains when they are not covered in snow anymore. And so I think it's exciting to hear that you have these plans that are not just chasing from one race to another, but you actually have ideas of grand days out, of big adventures that will give you a different focus, a different style of experience, and let you enjoy yourself, your life, and the outdoors in a complete different way. So I'm excited for that too.
Yeah, and I think it's also sort of a different thing, because sometimes when you're going for that adventure, you're less concerned about the time pressure, and it's more about just getting it done. Which I think maybe because I have been doing more of that lately, maybe that's part of why I was bad at the race, was because, when you're out doing just, last year I'm out running the Lewitt Trail, and nobody actually really cares whether how fast somebody like me does the Lewitt Trail in. And so, it's like, well, I can take my time if, here and there, I'm just out here to get it done, which is great for that. And, and so this summer, I think going back to a little bit more of that just get it done attitude will be a way that I can have some fun and do some interesting things. And then, who knows, maybe next spring, I don't think I'll be back at Yakima Skyline again, but maybe do some other kind of, go back and try that organized race thing again and see how it goes. And, I've run a couple different 50Ks in like just over 6 hours. I think like my two fastest ones are like 6:05 and 6:06. And so, maybe pick something that's a little bit flatter and faster and try to run a fast 50K faster than 6 hours. That might be an interesting goal that is still time oriented, bringing some pressure to it, but not quite, maybe that would be something that I would be a bit more suited to than trying to go back to, the hot sun of Yakima again. But, who knows? I think that, I like the idea of trying to balance both that adventure side of it with also the time goal, something that has the pressure of a time goal, and trying, I think in a perfect world, we'd all be able to do both those things and succeed at both those. But yeah, now summer is the time for adventures, and I'm looking forward to that.
You couldn't have finished on a better sentence. Summer is the time for adventures. Perfect. Alex, thanks for coming back and sharing your story and sharing a very interesting view into an aspect of our running and goal chasing that we don't often talk about.
Yeah, I think I'm interested to see what there is to learn about this because, it was, I think it's an experience that a lot of people have had in terms of having a frustrating race. And we sometimes talk too much about the successes and not enough about when things don't go quite so well. And so I think it's important to talk about.